Good afternoon, colleagues and guests. I am delighted to extend a warm welcome to all of you as we gather here today for our 2023-2024 inaugural expanded virtual brown bag session. My name is Alex Wiseman, and I have the honor of representing the Texas Tech University Educational Leadership Policy faculty as a professor and the Center for Innovative Research in Change, Leadership, and Education, which we call CIRCLE, as its director. Today, we're embarking together on an important educational expedition of sorts, one that transcends geographical boundaries and embraces the power of knowledge dissemination in our ever-evolving educational landscape. The expanded virtual brown bag series is a testament to CIRCLE's commitment to developing an environment of innovation, research, learning, and collaboration, both locally, regionally, nationally, and internationally. I'll begin by asking you to please check out and share our website with your colleagues, friends, and students. If you Google TTU Expanded, our website should be the first item in the results list. And register for as many of our upcoming virtual brown bags as you can. We want to see you there. I'm very proud to share with you that we've gathered a remarkable ensemble of researchers, educators, and experts as expanded speakers coming from as close as right here at Texas Tech University, as well as from highly esteemed institutions across the country. Our speakers' dedication to the pursuit of knowledge in the realms of educational practice, leadership, and policy is truly inspiring, and we're thrilled that they're willing to share their insights with all of us. So check out who else is speaking in the coming months and register to attend all of them. Before we transition to today's speakers, let me take just a minute to share a little more about our virtual brown bag series. The aim of ExpandED is multifaceted. It seeks to be a melting pot of ideas, a platform where students, faculty, and researchers can come together to delve into the critical issues that shape our educational landscape. So through this series, our speakers and panelists will bridge gaps, they'll foster dialogue, and they'll facilitate the cross-pollination of ideas that will drive innovation and broadly transform education and policy. We firmly believe that education and policy are intrinsically linked, and the decisions we make today hold the power to shape the future of our society. By sharing the latest research and cutting-edge practices, ExpandED empowers all of us to make informed choices, drive positive change, and inspire the educational leaders of tomorrow. But ExpandED isn't just about information, it's also about engagement. So, as is appropriate, we invite all of you to participate actively, ask questions, challenge assumptions, and collaborate with us in the pursuit of knowledge. Your perspectives, experiences, and ideas are invaluable, and they enrich our collective understanding. I'd like to express our gratitude for your presence here today and your commitment to the advancements of education and policy. And we're excited about the journey ahead this whole season and the incredible learning opportunities it promises. So without further ado, let's embark on this educational journey together. I'm going to start by saying that I'm truly honored to introduce our moderator and the organizer of today's panel, Dr. Rebecca Hite. Dr. Hite is a distinguished scholar and educator in the field of STEM education. She's an associate professor of STEM education at Texas Tech University and a highly accomplished researcher in the field, as well as holding numerous leadership positions. For example, Dr. Hite is the founder and primary director of the Texas site of the Education Policy Fellowship Program, which demonstrates her commitment to advancing educational policies that drive positive outcomes. As the associate chair of the Curriculum and Instruction Department at Texas Tech University's College of Education, Dr. Hite plays a pivotal role in shaping the academic landscape, ensuring the highest standards of excellence in education. Additionally, and maybe most importantly for me, she serves as an associate director of the Center for Innovative Research in Change, Leadership, and Education, which further highlights her dedication to research and leadership in the educational sphere. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Hite to the virtual podium as we begin our panel discussion today titled Beyond the Classroom, an exploration of rich and relevant STEM learning in informal and non-formal spaces.
She's an assistant professor at the University of Florida Museums. Megan, would you like to add any additional introduction for everyone?
Sure. I was recently promoted to be the director of the Thompson Earth Systems Institute. So we help scientists who engage in research related to land, air, water, and life, as well as our human impacts on those parts of our planet. And we help translate their research to the public. So happy to share more about that if folks are interested.
Fabulous, fabulous. Thank you so much. And then next but never least is Dr. Gina Childers. She's an assistant professor of STEM education and also the program coordinator of STEM education here at Texas Tech University. Dr. Childers, would you like to add anything else?
That introduction was fantastic. Thank you.
That's fabulous. Well, thank you all for being here. We really appreciate your time. So once again, this session's about non-formal and informal learning spaces. Just to give a little bit of context, so the continuum goes from formal to non-formal to informal based upon the type of curriculum instruction and the structuring therein. Formal spaces being K-12 classrooms where there are very explicit standards, curriculum that follows, as well as instruction. Whereas in non-formal, the curriculum is a little bit more I should say informal, but that's not the right word. It's typically looser in the sense that like you might have an after school STEM club where there's no standards per se, but there are still kind of structured experiences around curriculum instruction. And then of course, in our informal space, sometimes that's called free choice learning. These are things in which there is no real set rigid curriculum or instruction. So people are allowed to learn at their pace. So just that way that everybody's kind of on the same page. So first question I wanted to ask to the panel, and I'll start with Dr. Jones. Can you tell me a little bit about your research foci, either in informal or non-formal STEM education?
So research, we've been doing a whole series of studies that actually started with trying to understand kids' understanding of size and scale. Which led me to interview scientists about how did you learn about size and scale, which then led me to focus on their experiences that they had out of school, which were pretty amazing and contributing to their understandings of the sizes of things. That then led us to a grant that we got to look at hobbyists, science hobbyists in particular. We did a deep dive in birders and amateur astronomers, and then did hobbyists broadly. And so we looked at everything we could about hobbyists, what motivated them, what excited them, how did they practice their hobby, what resources do they use, what networks. And then that work led us to design a new museum program model that we implemented in 3 different museums to try to build science interests and career aspirations through families engaging in science at the museums. And Megan was very instrumental in that as well. So hats off to her. And I know Gina and others have also worked on the hobbies work. So I'll stop and let others contribute.
Absolutely. Dr. Ennes, do you want to, same question? Tell us a little bit about your scholarship in this space.
Sure. So as Gail mentioned, I started by looking at families. So I actually spent much of my career as a museum educator. So a lot of my research looks at professionalizing pathways for museum educators. There aren't traditional education programs you can go to be a museum educator, although the number of museum education programs is growing. And so I do work that started also with Dr. Jones on self-efficacy of informal and non-formal science educators to teach science. And so we'll have an updated set of results from that study coming out very soon. And we'll be sharing it at the Association of Science Technology Centers next month, their conference. That'll be fun. But a big part of my work really looks at how do we help support folks who come from groups that are typically underrepresented in science, and how do we help encourage their interests and support their career aspirations. And so in addition to family programs, I do a lot of work on scientist communication and how do we help particularly museum scientists improve the way they share their research to the public. And we have a number of programs on civic engagement for the environment and how we can help K-12 students as well as undergraduates who may not see themselves as science people, but really care about the environment. How do we help them feel empowered to take action in their communities to make a more sustainable planet? So my work spans quite a number of things, but my big umbrella is really just how do we bring more folks into science and STEM?
Fabulous. And Dr. Childers, can you tell us a little bit about your work in non-formal and informal STEM education?
Yeah, absolutely. I had a really fantastic undergraduate research experience at the University of North Georgia when I was a biology major. And I had the opportunity to work with a plant taxonomy professor, and we would travel all around Appalachia and do really cool taxonomic inventories of plants in the area. And so what we would do, we would take that information and we would share it at community fall festivals in the Appalachia Mountains, which was really, really fun because we had to translate what we were learning from these taxonomic inventories to the general public. And so when I was a part of that, that was just really, really exciting because, as Dr. Ennes has just shared, really being able to support and foster interest in science in the community, but also really inspiring the funness of science, right? Whenever I started my PhD journey with Dr. Jones, we were able to focus in really cool areas regarding some informal and non-formal learning spaces, especially family science nights, the hobbyist work that she had mentioned, and then also some of the museum studies as well. Now, me venturing into some areas that I am really, really interested in. I'm really interested in the community-based events. So the public and the community coming together and interacting with science experts and what's really happening in this space. And then ultimately, what is happening beyond this, right? So they come and they have fun, they're interested in whatever the science is occurring at these community-based events, but then what's happening afterwards, right? Are they sharing information with others? What are they doing with the information? Is this having any bearing on how they vote for their representatives and things of that nature? So specifically, recently I've been focusing on science cafes. And so these are spaces generally in bars, pubs, restaurants, where a science expert will come in and they'll give a talk while others are eating, drinking, having fun, and then being able to ask questions. So that was a really, really interesting space to see those interactions with one another and what those individuals at the science cafe events take away from it, and how do they then spread that to their own networks and their own communities. Another area is science fiction conventions. I am a nerd geek at heart. I love sci-fi, I love fantasy, and I also love going to conventions. They're so much fun. But what's really, really interesting about science fiction conventions, some of them actually have what they call science tracks. And in these tracks, they bring in science experts to talk about the science behind the science fiction. So for instance, if you're really into Game of Thrones and you're really interested in the inheritance and heredity issues regarding one of the families in the books, there will actually be a geneticist there to talk about inheritance over time regarding these very specific physical traits of the family. And so people from the public who are really interested in that fandom may not have science careers or STEM careers. They may not have a science or STEM hobby, but they're really interested in the mechanics behind their fandom. And sometimes they just really want to explore the reality behind the science fiction and behind what they really, really love. And so I've been really focusing in this area because I think is really fruitful to connect the interest in science, interest to specific fandoms, or maybe just interest in general, and really thinking about how can we support that funness of science within this area.
That's awesome. So I know interest came up a lot in what everybody was saying about kind of cultivating people's interests and really leaning into that. So my next question for the panel is, part of being good leadership is sharing your leadership story. How did each of you become interested in this specifically? A lot of STEM education research, and understandably so, is in the formal space. And of course, I see women, I see underrepresented individuals. So how did each of you, and Dr. Childers, I'll start with you. How did you become interested in this particular, perhaps niche of STEM education?
So I had recently shared about my undergraduate experience, but really my true interest started very much in early childhood. So I lived in a very rural area of Appalachia, and a lot of the things that we did as a family, such as garden, put food on the table, was really supported by science and engineering skills. Now, of course, as a kid, I didn't see it like that, and most of the people in my family or in my community did not see it like that. But there was always some sort of science or environmental thread that really interested me. So, gardening, for instance, when do we plant our seeds? How much attention do we give to our seeds when it starts to grow? How do we then help support that? Because really, at the end of the day, we had to put food on the table and also, preserve food for later times. Another thing that was really, really beautiful about Appalachia is we had that open, beautiful sky with very little light pollution. So the stars and astronomy was a really awesome way in exploring kind of our natural world and beyond that, right? And so, hearing stories from my family about, the stars and how did we get here was really, really something fascinating to me. And then another thing is really those engineering and building skills. When you kind of live out in the middle of nowhere, you don't have a lot of money, and if something breaks, what do you do? Well, you got to kind of build it or fix it yourself, right? And so, I grew up, in my family and my community. If the tractor broke, for instance, you got to go fix the tractor, right? Or if you needed something to house something, you had to build, a specific, space to be able to house things. And so there was a lot of problem solving. And again, as a kid, I really didn't see this, but growing up, I really gravitated towards those science and engineering skills, problem solving skills. And it just really, whenever, I went to college and beyond, it just really opened my kind of my worldview as far as there were some really interesting community stories, information that is being shared throughout generations. How is that information being shared within the community context? And then how do we then align that or connect that to science and engineering? So that's really where my interest started. And because of the community context, I'm just really interested in how science and engineering and things related to those ideas are kind of encapsulated within a community and how they're shared and how they're engaged with.
Fantastic. And put a pin in that tractor. We're going to come back to the tractor and the tinkering when you share some of your scholarship in this space. Dr. Ennes, how about you? How did you become interested in this? Especially you've spent a lot of your career in museums, which is kind of a alternative track to teaching. Perhaps the path less traveled. So tell us about how you became interested in that.
Yeah, so I grew up in Indiana and wanted to be a marine biologist because, as all landlocked children do. And so I went and started volunteering at the Shed Aquarium in Chicago, and I loved it. But what I realized I loved was not, I didn't want to clean the tanks. I did want to feed the fish, but I don't want to be responsible for feeding the fish all the time. What I really loved was going up to folks at exhibits and saying, hey, what is really cool about this fish? And just getting them so excited about it. And so I went to college and I decided to major in education and marine biology because I wanted to get folks excited about the ocean and the world and all the things that are amazing in that environment. And so I spent a decade as an aquarium educator. I loved being able to really connect folks to the planet. But as I started thinking about it, I realized there just weren't that many opportunities for folks to pursue those kinds of degrees. I mean, I did marine biology and education because I didn't know how else to get a degree to let me teach in aquariums. And now there are a few programs such as George Washington University has a master's in museum education, and there are a few more out there. But from our research, we've found that most of the folks who go into museum education, they have content backgrounds. They don't have any background in teaching, and they just find their way there because they're very passionate about it. But the opportunities for professionalizing those pathways are great. I mean, like we have so many ways to help really find ways to support these folks. And Dr. Jones and myself and a few other colleagues, we did some research during the pandemic about whether educators are staying in the museum field and what is driving them away. And a lot of it is the lack of being seen as a professional. And we find that in education broadly, because it's a pink collar career and tend to be lower paid and under, under-resourced and overtaxed, and we all do it because we love it. But I wanted to see how could we help support the folks that are doing this amazing work to help retain them and really just change the way folks see our museum educators, that they are the critical piece of our museum, because how else do we meet our mission, which are almost predominantly about education. So I feel very strongly about supporting our museum educators as a former museum educator. And then thanks to Dr. Jones, she expanded my interest from just museum educators to the families who come into these spaces and the youth who come into these spaces. And how do we just really continue to support their innate curiosity and love for the planet? Because we all are scientists when we're kids. We're curious about things. We ask questions. We do all the things that scientists do, and somehow we frequently lose that along the way. So I'm just clearly very passionate about trying to support our folks on all parts of their pathway to either keep them interested or bring them back if it's been a while since they asked questions about what makes our planet so amazing. Oh, did I freeze?
Fantastic. Sorry, our internet's a little unstable. I apologize if there's awkward gaps everywhere.
I just want to make sure it wasn't me.
Welcome to Texas Tech University. So thank you, Megan, for sharing that. And I would be interested to kind of maybe in the next round of questioning, revisit some of the research you've done with museum, as well as some of the work that's kind of evolved at UF as well. Dr. Jones. So Dr. Jones, for everybody to know, was a classroom teacher like myself and others, that we started in the formal space. And then as she has researched formal education, she has moved into this new space. So Dr. Jones, can you describe to us maybe how did you become interested in this crazy world of informal and non-formal STEM education?
Well, I might share something you don't even know about me, but when I was 21, in my first job, I had the opportunity to go teach some classes at our science museum here in town, and it was an amazing experience. And I watched, we have she's no longer with us anymore, but there was an amazing science educator at that museum, and I watched her teach, and I had just come out of my teacher education program, and I thought, wow, there's a whole nother skill set here that, we in formal ed could take advantage of. And so that got my interest in thinking about this intersection of formal and informal and pedagogical skills of each group and what we could learn from each other. So that was the very beginning, but I then went on and have done work with museums and different partnerships, both from a formal, and informal partnership, but also just working with museums. And kind of like Gina, I grew up, my undergrad and master's program was a lot. I took every course that had an ology on it, and particularly any course that had field work. And so, and like Gina, we were up in the Appalachian Mountains. And so it was pretty, that gave me this appreciation for what you get out of going out and identifying flowers and going out and, taking dendrology and figuring out your trees, or chasing down, lizards in the woods. And so I'm interested in formal ed, but I'm also very intrigued in how those kinds of experiences shape us and shape our interests, and kind of sustain our career aspirations. And I'm interested in how it alters educators' views of the work they do. I mean, I'll give my other example real quick, which was not that many years ago. I got to go to the Galapagos, and we had the most incredible naturalist interpreter who had such skill that it just blew me out of the water. And so I just, to this day, think a lot about how he was prepared and why he was so effective, and what we as teachers can learn from our colleagues in informal ed, and maybe what he might learn from us. So that's, you know, some of my initial early interests.
That's fantastic. So I do want to ask you a little bit about your research and some of the recent research that I think we'll find really intriguing. If you Google Scholar, Dr. Gail Jones, put on your get a snack. You're going to be there for a while. So some of the work I find really intriguing of yours is your work with the Marbles Children's Museum. So a lot of times when we think about K-12 STEM education, we focus more on secondary, right? Middle school, high school, even in elementary, but we kind of forget about that pre-K. And I think Dr. Ennes mentioned this about that other ideas of like that initial interest. And you've also been doing research on a construct of wonder. Can you share some of that work with us?
Yeah, the museum work was interesting, and I, you know, was chatting with some colleagues probably 20 years ago. And I thought, well, wouldn't it be interesting just to take kids and families and see if we could throw everything we know about how to build career aspirations into a program? Could we actually make a difference, you know, in a kid's interest in career aspirations? So we worked together, and 3 museums worked with us, and we literally took all the research on underserved youth and diversity, equity, and inclusion, and we put it together in a model I had done many, many years ago. I've done family science and family math programs. So combined with what we knew of what worked in those programs, and we created a model that we implemented where kids came once a month, but the child couldn't come without their a family member. Sometimes they brought 12 people. And as part of our model, we knew that families needed to have food. So we fed them usually a whole meal each time. We provided resources. They met community mentors. They did fun things together to investigate science. And then we studied, Megan did a whole series of studies and focused as part of her dissertation work on, you know, what are families getting out of it? But honestly, it's more the anecdotal stories to me that were just so powerful, where we had 3 parents that went back to school to change their majors because they heard about what STEM careers were like and what kind of money they could earn. And we also had, you know, we got a letter from one of the parents saying, my child's gone from an F to an A. And we thought, well, isn't that nice? You know, and she said, it's due to your program. And we thought, oh, but then we read a little more and it said, well, this was the sibling of the targeted 4th and 5th grade child that had been in our program. So this was his older brother who had come just to come with the family, and he had gone from an F to an A. So when we hear those kind of stories from our families, we know that we've made an impact, and we know there's something going on here to pay attention to. So that's some of the work. I would also just add that, you know, we interviewed science. Oh, you asked me to talk about wonder. So sorry, I was thinking about some other work that we did with scientists and looking at their childhood experiences. But I've become very intrigued with awe, like AWE, awe, which is actually technically defined a little bit different than wonder, but I'm really interested in how experiencing awe alters your understanding of the world. And there's some evidence to suggest that when you have an awe experience, it sort of causes a sort of a disequilibrium in your view of how things work or the world operates. So it might be watching an amazing rainbow, or going to Hawaii for me and seeing an active volcano and the lava going right past me. You know, those are awe experiences. And so it does alter your understandings of the world, and often it's science related. So we are continuing to do that and to see whether or not awe could be a pedagogical tool that would allow people, that could help us motivate people, push people, change people's worldview a little bit, that sort of thing. So I'll take a breath and let you call on somebody else.
No, that's fantastic. And I realize all work that is kind of related to teachers, but I think that there's definitely a connection to awe to, because kids are not awed a lot in the classroom, but they can be awed in, I'm using this word incorrectly, but everybody understands that the sense of awe can be cultivated in like a museum setting. So let's go back to Dr. Ennes. You mentioned a little bit about museum education and retention, or just the importance of floor staff. Can you talk a little bit about your research on museum educators?
Yeah, so when I went back to school, to work with Dr. Jones, I was very interested in museum educators, and thankfully she was very supportive in helping me find some ways to take a look at that. And so we had conducted a study on levels of self-efficacy to teach science in museums, and how skillful do folks feel in their ability to do all the tasks that are expected of museum educators. And what we found in our initial survey was that the areas where folks felt least competent was in their general facilitation skills, as well as teaching about physical sciences, so chemistry and physics, which may not seem like that happens very often, but when we talk about issues like climate change and other topics like that, we are talking about chemistry and physics. And so we had done that survey, and then the pandemic came, and there was major turnover in the field. Folks were furloughed, folks were fired, folks left because they just couldn't afford to stay. So we had major turnover in our field starting in 2020. And so I revised the survey a bit and added some more questions related to my research on teaching online in museums. And I sent the survey around again to see how folks are feeling in terms of their ability to teach online. And we found that folks rated themselves pretty highly for most of the concepts, which we also found the first time around. But our study this time found a negative correlation with how long somebody has been working in the field and how skillful they feel in their ability to teach, which makes sense because the more you know you don't know. And so people have a better idea of where they're more skillful and where they're not. But for that, we've actually done a factor analysis so that if museums want to use the survey with their staff, then they can take a factor score for 7 different categories of teaching skills. So that way we're not looking at all 60 skills individually, but rather a museum can say, most of my folks felt less than skillful in program management is one of the factors. So managing how folks come in and out of a space and interact in your program. So that way they can identify, well, this is an area for professional development for my team instead of having to go through the entire survey. So we should hopefully have that out soon. And I've also mentioned that I did a lot of research on how folks transitioned to online during the pandemic. I just happened to have started a study on that in February of 2020. So I had data from how museums were teaching online from like early in 2020. And so I was able to modify my IRB and ask the questions again after museum closures in March to see how museums had shifted to online programming during the pandemic. And we've redone the survey 1 year after and 3 years after closures. And what we found is in this 3rd year since closures, how folks are developing programming is much more representative of pre-COVID closures, which makes sense because we've now had time to develop online programming plans and to come up with programs that are specifically tailored for the online environment, whereas folks in the spring of 2020 were grabbing the programs they had and turning them online because they didn't have the capacity, time, or resources to do much of that work. They were frequently doing their programs on Facebook Live because nobody was using Zoom and nobody had access to it. And whereas now we're seeing a lot more planning and preparation, which is not to be unexpected. But again, the big issues are capacity because they lost so many staff and they don't have enough folks to teach in person and to teach online. I talked with some folks that were teaching in person all day and then expected to teach online programs in the evening. And oh my goodness, that sounds just exhausting. And they still don't have funding for these kinds of programs. And because there's so much free content online, it's hard to get folks to pay for it. And they have found that a lot of classroom teachers have had to cancel once they find out that a program costs money. But a lot of museums struggle with investing in these programs if they can't make a return on that investment. So still a lot to figure out in that space, still ongoing, but Zoom, as Rebecca pointed out, is not going away. Like, we're going to be online for the rest of our lives. So figuring out how we can support educators who are teaching online from museums will be very valuable as we move forward.
That's fantastic. Yeah, it's weird to think that there was a before times, like before.
Right.
Zoom.
Well, I laugh because I defended my dissertation with Dr. Jones on Zoom in 2019 because there were folks that wanted to attend that couldn't be in North Carolina. And I had no idea how to share screen or any of that stuff. And we couldn't tell that people were chatting in questions. I still don't know to this day if we ignored somebody who was on the chat because we just never played with this stuff before.
That's fascinating. Okay, so I want to go to Dr. Childers. Dr. Childers, I know you have lots of fun things to talk about. Obviously, I'm really intrigued by your Appalachia work. I know that you also do work in cybersecurity, so I want to make sure that's on the plate as well as a lot of really cool science fiction. I know a lot of your science fiction work has just been recently published as well. So feel free to pick from any three of those buckets to talk about some of your findings.
Yeah, I'll kind of share maybe a reflection as far as my experiences working with these different informal groups, because I think I found something very interesting with science fiction conventions that maybe need to be explored a little more. So a lot of the work that I've done, either with my own research group or with collaboration with Dr. Jones, with the STEM hobbyists, and things of that nature, science cafes. The individuals who were attending these sessions tend to be older white people. And when you're thinking about creating a fun, interesting space for everyone, but yet these are the individuals who are choosing to engage in these spaces, they're really not in equilibrium with one another, right? They're not in alignment. What we found at science fiction conventions was actually quite different. The composition of individuals who were attending these sessions is actually quite different from the older white male kind of grouping that we were seeing in other informal spaces. When we actually started to interview several of the individuals who were attending these science tracks at these conventions, especially the individuals who don't have an interest, outside of that in science or don't have a STEM career, a couple of things they had shared with us, the reason why they're engaging in these spaces is one is non-threatening as far as speaking with the experts. So that was really, really important. And many of the experts at least at DragonCon, they do have diverse backgrounds and diverse demographics and things of that nature. Is not necessarily always older white men who are presenting or being experts in their field. So them sharing that was non-threatening was something that was really, really important. They also shared that the space at DragonCon was very inclusive and welcoming. Sometimes these individuals shared that in other spaces they don't feel like they're welcomed or they really don't see others like themselves. And they just tend to not engage in those spaces. But what they shared at DragonCon was that the individuals were friendly and the spaces were friendly. And what really connected them was the interest in the fandom. So if I'm really interested in Game of Thrones and I found someone else who was really interested in Game of Thrones, and we were looking at the convention activities and we say, oh, there's this really cool science track about Game of Thrones, let's go together. And we would attend and we would get to talk about our interests within a space that was very friendly and welcoming and very inclusive. What I would like to share about that is this kind of thought, at least from these individuals that we interviewed, has shifted from what people would stereotypically think about science fiction conventions, perhaps maybe a few years ago. Stereotypically, they think of, nerdy young white men, I have no interest in being around those geeky, nerdy boys, things of that nature. But now that science fiction and fantasy have just really blossomed within social media, and then, in other spaces like TV, movies, books, anime, and the ability to really be able to interact and actually have access to these materials has really expanded the type of people who are engaging and are interested in these activities. And so when they come now to DragonCon, for instance, and now they can actually engage in spaces where they can learn about science through their interest in their fandom. So this was something that was really, really interesting for us, because me going into this, I have a lot of, personal experience going to science fiction conventions. But me going into it, I was like, okay, we're probably going to get the older white men who want to be interviewed, or we're going to see the older white men being the experts and scientists. And we didn't really see that with their experiences at DragonCon. So this was really, really interesting and extremely important, because you were really talking about the inclusivity, being very welcomed in the space and not feeling threatened. And so when we're thinking about perhaps building our community-based STEM learning spaces within our own context, really thinking about perhaps that environment and how we're connecting with people. It's one thing to set up, for instance, a science cafe event, bring in one of your scientists, they chat, people eat, great. But really, where's that connection with individuals, especially at their interest level? And this is really hard to do with public events, because when you have an open public event, you don't know who's going to show up. You don't know what their prior experiences are. You don't know, any prior information about the individuals. And then you have to talk about science to perhaps, an age range of like 4 to 94, right? But what I think is really unique about DragonCon is that, or science fiction conventions in general who do host science tracks, is that they do have it specifically related to a fandom, which then helps kind of, work with that prior experience, prior knowledge, because they're coming in with an interest within that fandom, and then they can connect that science or engineering to that. And so that's what I really, really wanted to share with you all, is there is a space out there at science fiction conventions that really is hosting attendees and experts from various diverse backgrounds. And then we just really think about what were the best practices here, or what is working here, and what could we try to do to emulate this into other informal or non-formal spaces, so that we can start to get more of a representation from our communities.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. I think that underrepresentation has always been a question mark, at least in the eyes of the NSF. And I think you're finding a very fruitful area to recruit as well as retain underrepresented individuals, right? I'm not going to say just people who've been minoritized, right? Perhaps by the mainstream, and that they can engage in STEM. And like you said, a very safe but welcoming kind of space for people like them.
Yeah. Just to add a little bit more about their interviews, a lot of them had some fairly traumatic experiences with science and mathematics related to teaching and curriculum. And so for them to be able to take that faith-based, step and go into this area that's related to their fandom, I think is something that's really important, that we really think about as far as, creating these spaces. Absolutely.
Fantastic. So I'm going to take a little bit of a break. I know we have one more question. It's going to be about policy, because this is a brown bag about policy. I know some people are like, lady came to a policy talk. But I wanted to provide some questions. So we have a question from Marty from North Carolina, my old stomping grounds. I'm going to read it out loud. And I see Dr. Jones responded, but maybe we can have a larger conversation. Marty said, in North Carolina, many non-formal science and nature facilities and programs work closely with schools and provide carefully correlated lessons and activities. Oh yes, must align to the standards, right? Where does this fit on the continuum? Though not taught by classroom teachers, it seems to lean towards the formal side. Do we need a new term to describe this? Panelists, thoughts?
So I am part of the informal learning research environments special interest group with the American Association of AERA, American Educational Research Association. Sorry, too many acronyms. And one of the conversations we have frequently is the terminology. And is it semantic? Do we really need to focus on whether it's non-formal, informal, formal, and how do those all align, and where really are the delineations between one or the other? And so that's a conversation the research community is really wrestling with, but we have some folks who feel very strongly that no, we use them interchangeably. They all, we all understand what we're trying to say. And then there are other folks who are very strict about, informal is like family learning. It has nothing to do with like the structured learning here, even at the museums, and that what we should be referring to ourselves as is non-formal because we're just outside of the classroom. But a lot of the programs we do in museums are formal. Like, so if we are teaching a program related to classroom standards in a classroom here at the museum, what should we call that? So Marty, I think that's a really good question, and one I think a lot of folks are still wrestling with. I don't know if Dr. Jones or Dr. Childers have some other perspectives on that.
I'll jump in a little bit. My museum partners educated me, particularly at our play museum, that they would shudder to hear me paraphrase it this way, but that they're not about education. I mean, I got taken to school, to use that expression, to say, Gail, that's not our goal to educate. Our goal is play. Our goal is all those things that go around play. So when I think of many of our informal, non-formal, science centers, etc., aquariums, zoos, sometimes they have formal goals of education, but often it's about these many other things. And I think for each one of these organizations, it's worth thinking about what they see as their goal. Maybe the goal is skills, processes, appreciation, those kind of non-formal things that are also equally or more important in building knowledge and interest in science or engineering. And so I kind of am fascinated, that's why I wrote in the chat that I would hate to think my Galapagos naturalist had to correlate what he was going to say to our North Carolina science standards. That would just make me shudder. Instead, he showed me a world and a way of thinking about the world and a whole nother world of organisms, and in a very refreshing, motivating, and amazing context. So I know that often informal, non-formal organizations are seeking funding, and so they have to show how they support formal education. But I'm one of those people that will argue we need that, but we also need them to do what they do best, and we need to compensate them for this amazing work they do, which can be entertainment, it can be educational, or it could be something else, that other place where play and investigation and excitement and joy and wonder live. So how about Gina?
Yeah, what I would share here is communication is absolutely vital. If you are going to be working with museum educators or other non-formal, informal individuals or organizations and/or formal, having that communication and understanding before doing anything is really, really important. So, what are my needs? What are my objectives? What are their needs? What are their objectives? And sharing that, so communicating that. So, like in Dr. Jones and Dr. Ennes' case, especially with the museum study, this was a longitudinal study that two entities worked together to create this experience for students and families. So in this particular case, there had to be very specific, clear communication about the contextual issues, the background, the experiences, what's going to be created. So I don't know if it's really more terms. It's more of ensuring that all parties, have a very clear understanding of what is occurring with these partnerships before just jumping into it. And so I would say that's really, really important moving forward. Is really thinking about what are the ultimate end goals and how are they going to be supported and facilitated, and then what are the roles of individuals involved, and making sure that that communication piece is absolutely important with that.
Right. And it becomes policy implications, right? Because if we have this much pie for STEM education, it's kind of important that, we slice it in a way that, OST or, whatever you want to call it, it's not getting left out in the cold. Another question came in from Dr. Alex Wiseman. I'm going to allow him to come off of mute. Hopefully he's still there. Okay, he is. Because he is the director of the Circle Center and kind of the orchestrator of the ExpandED series that we're all participating in. Dr. Wiseman, would you like to ask your question to the panel? I think you have a few.
Yeah, I would love to. And I apologize. I had a little snafu with the links earlier, so I'm glad that we're all here. I think that Dr. Ennes already answered this in the chat, but I was interested in how AI or machine learning or algorithms or whatever, there's a lot of talk in formal education settings about how it can personalize learning experiences for kids based on what they put in. And I'm not sure if that's something that applies as much in informal settings. I mean, I was trying to imagine, I think Dr. Ennes, you mentioned what you were working on related to museums. I'm really interested in how that would work with the sci-fi gatherings, to be honest. But is that a thing, or am I just barking up the wrong tree?
How about I start with a very general, this would be what would be kind of cool, because I'm not personally in the museum context. For me, as an individual going to museums or science centers or other related areas or organizations or spaces, for me, it's personalizing my own trip and my own learning. So with AI or any other models that can help me personalize my learning space going through an informal space like museums or what have you, I think that could be absolutely it could be very powerful, depending on how it's implemented. Because I do see personalization and personal choice as being extremely important as far as really continue to foster our interest in engaging in these spaces. So if there was a tool there to help me do that, that would be fantastic. Or if there was very specific tools there to help me engage with objects or artifacts that maybe I can't touch, or things that I can't really experience, within my own personal bubble, however you may want to define that. These particular advanced AI tools might be something that could be helpful in creating those personalized learning spaces for people.
And I'll jump in and just say there are some models of that already exist. So people are using, Gina's referred to it, but you can, already you can go into a museum, you have your phone, you enter your information, your interests, and as you move through a museum setting or a park, then you get different options, and your follow-up options can also vary. So I think just like schools, we're seeing it in informal spaces. But it's going to be pretty awesome, because maybe when I go up to the dinosaur, I want to look inside of its body, but somebody else wants to see it roar and tromp through the woods. I don't know, but I think we're just beginning to touch the surface.
Yeah, can I just interject real quick? One of the things that's fascinating to me about this is I think, and you tell me if I'm wrong, that there's a difference between individuals sort of selecting what their preferences are and then personalization happens versus the personalization being driven by machine. And I wonder how that affects what the interaction might be. Maybe this is relevant to the museum space in particular.
And I think that's fascinating, and I'm not sure anybody's looking at it yet, because as I mentioned, we had a whole search for faculty members that research AI in museums, and the top candidate we had was looking at how AI is used for exhibit development. So using Connect sensors to react to how folks are engaging with the exhibit, but we really didn't have anybody who was looking at like the experience or how education could be facilitated using AI.
Fantastic. We're getting close to the hour, so I want to make sure I ask my last question, which is about policy. So, colleagues, as we all know, when we get in front of a policymaker, we may have 30 to 60 seconds to give kind of our elevator speech. Based upon your scholarship, based upon your lived experiences as a researcher in this space, what would be some policy recommendations you would make related to your work to promote non-formal, informal STEM education to a policymaker? Dr. Jones, you're up first.
All right, my policy issues. One would be to fund informal, non-formal science education and recognize the critical importance it has for developing childhood interests. And we need to quit treating non-formal, informal as, you know, I don't know what, but as something superfluous or, you know, so definitely fund it. Provide professional development for museum educators. I think that should be an important part of policy, that as we fund it, we look for a sharpening of educational expertise and with that comes pay raises for people who are highly educated. I think giving more consideration to making non-formal programs aware for youth and, you know, in rural areas and remote areas. Right now there's this huge, I don't know if there's a word for it, we should make one up in the symposium, but a desert. There are deserts where kids don't have, you know, they might have 4-H. I know I saw 4-H appear, and 4-H and a few other programs like that, but they don't have the museums and many of the kinds of extensive science centers that we have, for example, in my own community. And then I think just valuing and recognizing the interface between formal and non-formal. And we don't have time. I know I'm out of time, but Marty, I realize we maybe misinterpreted one of your points, but well, I'll move. But I know Rebecca wants to move it on to somebody else.
Dr. Ennes, what about you? What are some of your policy recommendations for the great state of Florida?
So many. But as part of the Thompson Earth Systems Institute, we actually have something called the Scientist in Residence program, which is part of our Scientists in Every Florida School, where we take museum scientists and help prepare them to do K-12 outreach, to really engage students in our collections, in the research, the real world research that's happening right now. And in the county south of us, we have what's called a scientist in residence, and he is actually part of that school system. And so because he's part of the school system, he's able to reach 100% of the schools and engage them in science learning from our museum. And he actually lives at the Silver River Museum. So we have this really tight partnership that we couldn't have otherwise without policies in place to allow him to be part of the school district. So if we can find ways to help out of school spaces like museums become embedded into the school system, it would reduce a lot of the barriers for teachers to be able to use our facilities, to bring in scientists. So we just found out West Palm Beach, their school district pays $100,000 a year for a program that does virtual scientist visits to their classroom. We offer that to all Florida schools for free. So our new policy goal is to convince them to quit paying for that programming and pay for a scientist in residence that would have more tailored opportunities that really would contextualize the environment of Florida, our local issues, and how we can all work together to really improve upon all of it. So I dropped our Florida Scientists in Every Florida Schools program in the chat if anybody's curious to know more.
Fantastic. Dr. Childers, how about some policy implications for the state of Texas?
Well, okay, so let me just share with everyone, I do not have a policy background in any way, shape, or form. However, policy is very, very important. So I think I would just summarize maybe these key points. Education is important. regardless of type or program, and it should be funded. This should be across the board regardless, even though we're not seeing this. Because it's really, really strange that, especially with the geopolitical lens, which I have some issues with, the geopolitical lens, you know, they want A, B, and C as far as STEM careers are concerned, yet they're not funding education to help support these. Is really it's not aligning, right? So that doesn't make any sense. So of course, education is important. Education should be funded. But a couple of other things to really think about. Science is everywhere, and learning happens all the time. And so if there are these, you know, regional, community, state, national pushes for, you know, supporting these, you know, governmental agendas, then we really need to put our focus and our attention and our money into supporting STEM education, education in general, and not to other education programs such as informal, non-forming learning spaces. Because as we are seeing with our research, we are meeting a diverse group of individuals' needs. We're connecting it to their interests, and we're creating really fun spaces for them. And so really we need to think about, okay, if these are truly our agenda bullets that we want to accomplish, then education and funding it and the appropriate programs aligned to that is absolutely key for all of it.
Well said. Well, thank you, everyone. First, let's give a virtual or, you know, round of applause for Drs. Jones, Ennes, and Childers. Thank you so much. We really appreciate it. I have to go because you know, in the world of academia, I'm leading a meeting at 1. So I will leave it to Dr. Wiseman to, if anybody has any additional questions for our panelists to please do so. But thank you all for attending, and thank you. And we have many more expanded ed opportunities that Dr. Wiseman will discuss now.
Thank you, Dr. Hite, and thank you, panelists. I'm not going to keep you any longer. I know this is meant to be a brown bag that's 1 hour. I just want to say thank you truly for joining us. This is recorded, and we will have it up on our website very shortly, and I will let all of you know when it's there. So thank you so much.
Thank you.
Bye-bye. Thank you.